What drives a person to kill their own parents? That question alone makes most of us recoil, even before we hear the details. But in the case of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, the horror wasn't just in the act. It was in the shocking discovery of what the FBI found afterward. A 78-year-old Hollywood legend, a beloved wife, and a son living just steps away in their guest house. And yet, something dark had been festering behind the closed doors of their Brentwood estate, something that no amount of fame, wealth, or influence could shield them from. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was a Sunday that started like any other, or so it seemed. Rob and Michelle, known for their warmth, philanthropy, and high-profile careers, had spent Saturday evening at a gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. Friends, laughter, and conversation. The kind of night you imagine in magazines when you think of Hollywood's glittering social circles. But hidden beneath the pleasantries was a tension that few noticed at the time. A brief, loud argument between Rob and their son Nick had erupted. Witnesses said it was over something seemingly trivial, yet there was an intensity in Nick's voice that left a mark on the air. At the time, no one could have imagined that this small spark would ignite into a fire so devastating it would consume an entire family. By early Sunday morning, tragedy had struck. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were found lifeless in their $13.5 million Brentwood home, victims of multiple sharp force injuries. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner would later confirm the severity. The deaths were not quick, not sudden, but the result of deliberate, repeated actions. For those who loved them, the shock was unimaginable. For the city, it was incomprehensible. And for the FBI, the scene they encountered was a puzzle filled with horrifying details, one that would send shockwaves through Hollywood and beyond. Nick Reiner, 32, the son who lived in the guest house, became the immediate focus of the investigation. Within hours, police tracked him down to Exposition Park in South Los Angeles. Surveillance video had captured his movements after leaving the estate, including a stop at a gas station and an early morning hotel check-in in Santa Monica. Authorities arrested him that same evening, and he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The charges included the use of a deadly weapon, a knife. But what motivated him? And what exactly did investigators uncover that made the FBI's findings so shocking? To understand, we need to rewind. We need to look past the headlines and the glossy veneer of Hollywood fame. We need to examine the layers of family history, personal struggles, and hidden resentments that had been quietly building over decades. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a father, a husband, and a public figure whose life was lived under constant scrutiny. Yet, even under that scrutiny, no one saw the storm brewing within his own home. Michelle, ever supportive, balanced a demanding life with grace, but perhaps even she couldn't foresee the violence that awaited them. And Nick? What led a grown man, living in the house of the parents who raised him, to commit such an unfathomable act? In the hours before the murders, the Reiners had been attending the party at Conan O'Brien's house. According to sources, the argument between father and son had been brief but intense. The details are sparse, but insiders described a clash of personalities, a collision of frustration and unspoken grievances. Rob, a man whose life had been shaped by creativity and discipline, and Nick, a younger man whose own ambitions and frustrations may have been simmering under the surface. Could such a minor disagreement have ignited the violence that followed? Perhaps, but the story does not end there. The FBI's investigation would reveal that there were deeper currents, hidden under years of appearances, that ultimately erupted in the deadliest way possible. As the investigation unfolded, authorities discovered more than just the physical evidence of the murders. There were notes, items, and behavioral patterns that painted a picture of premeditation and deep-seated anger. Investigators described the scene as chilling, a testament not only to the violence of the act, but to the emotional state of the perpetrator. And yet, there were contradictions that baffled even seasoned agents. How could someone so close to the victims harbor such intense feelings without any outward signs for those around him? How could fame, success, and familial love coexist with such a lethal undercurrent of resentment? By the time Nick was taken into custody, questions far outnumbered answers. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues of the Reiners were left reeling. Hollywood, a world that thrives on drama and spectacle, was confronted with a real-life tragedy far darker than anything the cameras could capture. The public was in shock. Social media buzzed with speculation, rumors, and heartbreak. And yet, the FBI was only beginning to peel back the layers of the story. A story that would reveal things about the Reiner family no one could have imagined. There is a peculiar irony in the situation. Rob Reiner had built a career out of storytelling, of crafting narratives that touched audiences on a deep emotional level. Yet the story unfolding in his own life was one that not even the most skilled screenwriter could have predicted. Michelle, ever compassionate and loving, had dedicated herself to family and community, unaware that the home she had nurtured would become the scene of such horror. And Nick, whose actions would shatter lives and legacies, left behind a trail of clues that the FBI would interpret with a mix of horror and fascination. As we go deeper into this story, it is essential to understand that this is not just a tale of crime. It is a study of family dynamics, mental health, and the dangerous consequences of unresolved tension. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How well do we really know those closest to us? How easily can suppressed anger turn into irreversible action? And most chilling of all, what was hiding behind the seemingly normal exterior of one of Hollywood's most iconic families? The stage was set. The players were in place. And the events of that fateful Sunday would forever alter the course of lives, legacies, and the perception of safety within the Reiner household. The FBI's discoveries, which we will explore in detail, were not just evidence. They were revelations about the human psyche, about the fragility of trust, and about the unexpected darkness that can exist even in the most familiar places. In the next chapter, we will delve into the Reiner family legacy, exploring not only Rob and Michelle's remarkable achievements, but also the hidden tensions and subtle warning signs that foreshadowed the tragedy. Because before we understand the crime, we must first understand the people, the relationships, and the intricate web of emotions that made such a shocking outcome possible. The night of the murders was not a sudden anomaly. It was the climax of years of unnoticed friction, emotional battles, and quiet obsessions. And the FBI's findings? They would reveal not only what happened that Sunday morning, but also the unsettling reality of what had been simmering beneath the surface all along. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean to live in the shadow of a legend? For Nick Reiner, it was more than a question, it was a daily reality. Rob Reiner wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a Hollywood institution. From his early acting days on All in the Family to directing iconic films like This Is Spinal Tap, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men, Rob had crafted a life filled with acclaim, influence, and power. Yet behind the accolades and the cameras, a different story was unfolding, a story that, until that fateful Sunday, few outside the family would have guessed existed. Rob's life was meticulously public, yet private in ways that mattered most. He was a perfectionist in his work, a devoted father in his own way, and a man of strong opinions. Those who knew him well described him as both charismatic and intimidating, a man whose presence could fill a room, but whose expectations could weigh heavily on those closest to him. Michelle Singer Reiner, his wife of decades, was the balance to his intensity. At 70, she had navigated life alongside Rob, supporting his career while carving out her own identity. Warm, intelligent, and compassionate, Michelle was the anchor of the family, the one who smoothed over friction and maintained a semblance of harmony. Nick Reiner, however, had always been a complex figure within this family dynamic. Born into privilege and fame, he grew up surrounded by the glitter of Hollywood and the pressure of expectations. To the outside world, he was a young man living in the lap of luxury, shielded from struggle, and yet the reality of his upbringing was layered with tension. There were reports of disagreements, subtle clashes, and moments of disconnection between Nick and his parents. For some, it might have seemed like ordinary familial friction. For others, it was a warning sign that something darker lingered beneath the surface. To understand the tragedy that unfolded, we have to look at the family's inner world, the small, quiet moments that often go unnoticed but leave lasting impressions. Friends of the Reiners spoke of Nick as someone who could be charming one moment and unpredictable the next. Those who observed interactions between father and son described a dynamic fraught with unspoken expectations and simmering resentment. Rob, a man used to commanding attention on set and on stage, expected respect, discipline, and a certain level of engagement from his family. Michelle, ever supportive, often found herself mediating between father and son, smoothing over tensions that might otherwise erupt. But even the most loving families carry secrets. Every household has its quiet corners, its locked drawers, its unspoken arguments. For the Reiners, some of those corners held tension that would eventually boil over. There were small incidents, easily dismissed at the time, that when pieced together painted a picture of a relationship that had frayed over the years. Nick's living arrangements, residing in the guest house rather than the main home, may have seemed innocuous, but it represented a separation that carried both psychological and emotional significance. Proximity to one's parents does not always mean closeness, and in this case, distance may have allowed resentment to grow unseen. Beyond the domestic sphere, there was the public pressure. Rob Reiner, as a filmmaker and actor, lived under constant scrutiny. Interviews, public appearances, awards ceremonies. Every success was magnified, every misstep analyzed. For Nick, growing up in that environment may have felt like living in the shadow of an unrelenting spotlight. Imagine a life where nothing is ordinary, where your every action is observed, where the accomplishments of one parent can cast long shadows over the ambitions of the next generation. How does one carve out identity and agency in that environment? For some, it breeds drive and resilience. For others, it breeds frustration and, in extreme cases, anger that festers silently. Those who knew the Reiners well often remarked on their household as being both loving and high pressure. The duality was striking. A home full of warmth and laughter, yet underneath, a network of expectations and tensions that could be suffocating. It is easy to look back and wonder which moments were the turning points, which arguments, which silences, which small signs were overlooked. The truth is, these things often go unnoticed until they culminate in something irreversible. Adding to the complexity was the influence of Hollywood itself, a world of drama, rivalry, and spectacle. Fame can act as both a shield and a magnifier. The Reiners were no strangers to public attention, and the pressures that came with that spotlight may have influenced family dynamics in subtle, unspoken ways. There is a peculiar weight that accompanies wealth and celebrity. The expectation that your family should match your image, that they should reflect the success you have built. For Nick, the contrast between the life he observed and the life he wanted may have planted seeds of discontent that grew quietly over time. Friends and neighbors described Nick as intelligent, but sometimes volatile, capable of extreme charm, yet quick to anger. Rob Reiner, on the other hand, was disciplined, structured, and often rigid in his expectations. Michelle tried to act as the bridge, yet there are limits to what a mediator can accomplish when the underlying issues are deeply personal. In the weeks and months leading up to the tragedy, those who interacted with Nick noted subtle changes, moments of isolation, brief bursts of irritation, and behaviors that hinted at inner turmoil. It is the kind of pattern that seems minor until the consequences are unimaginable. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Reiner family dynamic is how easily appearances masked reality. To the public, the family seemed ideal, accomplished, elegant, connected, and loving. Yet appearances are fragile. They can conceal bitterness, obsession, and the unspoken resentments that simmer in private spaces. For Rob and Michelle, fame may have provided a shield from external judgment, but it could not protect them from the storm brewing within their own home. As we begin to understand the Reiner family legacy, it becomes clear that this was not a simple story of wealth or fame. It was a story of human complexity, of relationships strained by expectation, of emotions left unchecked. The seeds of tragedy were sown in the interactions between father and son, in the silent observation of friends and neighbors, in the unspoken words that passed between family members in quiet corners of the estate. And the FBI, when they arrived, would encounter evidence that pointed not only to the act itself but to the deeper, more disturbing currents that had been present for years. Nick's relationship with his parents was multifaceted. He had moments of genuine connection and affection, but these were interspersed with tension, defiance, and emotional distance. The argument at Conan O'Brien's party was not an isolated event. It was the latest in a series of interactions that, when viewed together, suggested a volatile mix of resentment, frustration, and unexpressed anger. For those observing, it was easy to see the surface-level discord. What was impossible to see, until that Sunday, was the intensity of the feelings beneath it. In understanding this family, we must also consider the psychological dimension. How does prolonged tension between parent and child manifest? How do suppressed feelings evolve over time? Experts in family dynamics often warn that unaddressed resentment can build silently, especially in households where wealth and fame mask emotional realities. The Reiners' story illustrates this phenomenon in a chilling way. The very traits that allowed them to succeed publicly, discipline, ambition, and structure, may have contributed to an environment where emotional struggles went unnoticed, unspoken, and ultimately deadly. By now, the pieces are beginning to form a picture. The Reiner family was not unusual in its complexities. What made this tragedy extraordinary was how private grievances, personal frustrations, and subtle behavioral patterns culminated in an act that shocked the world. The stage was set long before the Sunday of the murders, with every decision, interaction, and silence contributing to the outcome. But even as we examine these dynamics, one question remains central. How did the FBI interpret what they found in the aftermath? Because the evidence was not just about a crime scene. It was about human behavior, about hidden motives, and about the intensity of a relationship that had quietly turned lethal. Understanding the family legacy is crucial, but it is only the beginning. What comes next is the unraveling of the moments leading directly to that fateful morning, the warning signs missed, and the shocking clues discovered by investigators that would change the narrative of the Reiner household forever. And yet, even as the picture becomes clearer, there are still mysteries. Details that confound logic, behaviors that challenge expectation, and evidence that forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the family. Because the Reiners' tragedy was not a simple story of anger or impulse. It was a story of hidden obsession, psychological tension, and a darkness that, until discovered by the FBI, existed unseen. Who really is the person standing silently in the shadows of fame? For Nick Reiner, that question may have never been asked, at least not out loud. To outsiders, he was the son of Hollywood royalty, living comfortably in the guest house of his parents' $13.5 million Brentwood estate. A young man with opportunities, connections, and privilege beyond most people's dreams. And yet, as the events of that fateful Sunday would reveal, appearances can be fatally deceptive. Nick was 32, an age when many are still trying to carve out identity and purpose. But unlike most, his life unfolded under constant comparison. Every achievement of his father, every milestone of his mother, every public moment of his family was magnified. Growing up, Nick had to navigate a world where the bar for success was set impossibly high. Rob Reiner was a legend. Michelle was intelligent, nurturing, and socially influential. For Nick, this wasn't just a family dynamic. It was a psychological landscape of expectation, admiration, and, eventually, pressure. Those who observed Nick closely described a man who could oscillate between charm and unpredictability. One moment, he was polite, articulate, even engaging. The next, he could be irritable, withdrawn, and visibly frustrated. Friends of the family said that he could engage in casual conversations with humor and wit, yet beneath the surface, there was a tension that seemed to grow stronger over time. Was it resentment? Was it frustration at being overshadowed by his parents' successes? Or something deeper, more personal, more dangerous? Nick's upbringing was enveloped in a mix of love and high expectation. Rob Reiner's discipline and ambition were well known. His career required focus, precision, and assertiveness. Growing up under such a parent can inspire confidence, or it can breed anxiety and suppressed anger. Michelle, as a mother and mediator, tried to maintain harmony. Yet, even the most attentive parent cannot fully shield a child from internal conflict, particularly when that conflict is compounded by privilege, isolation, or a lack of personal achievement. One striking aspect of Nick's personality, according to insiders, was his ability to mask his emotions. He could appear calm, collected, and even cheerful while harboring frustration or inner turmoil. This duality, charming yet volatile, made it difficult for outsiders to read him, and perhaps even his parents. Many of the warning signs were subtle. A fleeting expression of anger, moments of withdrawal, or minor disputes that seemed trivial but hinted at a deeper unrest. Adding to the complexity was Nick's relationship with the world outside the family. Though he lived under the shadow of Hollywood fame, he did not always navigate it successfully. Reports suggest periods of instability, behaviors that seemed incongruous with his privileged upbringing. Friends noticed mood swings, unusual behaviors, and signs that something in his mental or emotional state was shifting. And yet, he was able to maintain a facade of normalcy, making it all the more difficult to anticipate the events that would follow. In the months leading up to the tragedy, neighbors described Nick as reclusive, often keeping to himself in the guest house. He would come and go at odd hours, occasionally interacting with family and friends, but largely maintaining a distance that suggested both independence and detachment. Such isolation, coupled with unexpressed frustration, can sometimes become a dangerous breeding ground for extreme behaviors, especially when combined with unresolved familial tensions. The party at Conan O'Brien's house was a revealing glimpse of Nick's state of mind. Witnesses described a brief but intense argument with his father, a clash of personalities, of pride, and perhaps unspoken grievances. At the time, the incident seemed minor, an ordinary disagreement in a household accustomed to public scrutiny. But in hindsight, it was a warning, a spark that foreshadowed the darkness about to be unleashed. What made the argument alarming was not its content, but its intensity, the unusual way Nick's voice rose, the tension in his body language, and the look in his eyes, a mix of anger, defiance, and perhaps desperation. Those who knew Nick also spoke of contradictions. On one hand, he was a son with privileges that most could only dream of. On the other, he displayed moments of agitation, frustration, and isolation that suggested a mind struggling with internal conflict. He could discuss intellectual topics, engage in casual humor, and appear socially adept, yet at the same time, he harbored impulses and emotions that no one fully understood. These contradictions would later be critical in understanding the FBI's investigation and what they uncovered at the crime scene. Nick's relationships outside the family were equally complex. While he had acquaintances and friends, he did not seem to form deep bonds outside of his family circle. His social interactions were often brief, superficial, and punctuated by periods of withdrawal. This pattern of isolation may have amplified his focus on the family, intensifying both admiration and resentment in equal measure. Experts often note that when someone becomes emotionally fixated on a small circle of people, unresolved tensions can take on dangerous proportions, particularly when those feelings are paired with access to a private space and a sense of personal grievance. Psychologists who later reviewed public reports suggested that Nick may have exhibited signs of underlying mental health challenges. Mood swings, irritability, impulsive behaviors, and periods of social withdrawal are all common indicators. Whether these challenges were recognized, understood, or addressed by the family remains unclear, but their presence adds another layer to the complex psychological portrait. When combined with long-standing familial expectations and the pressures of living in a high-profile household, such factors can create a volatile environment, one that is prone to explosive outcomes. Nick's behavior in the hours following the murders also reflected this volatility. After the tragic event, he did not flee far from the scene. Surveillance cameras showed him checking into a hotel in Santa Monica, a mere 4 miles from the family estate. He was later seen in a convenience store before being apprehended by law enforcement in South Los Angeles. These movements suggest a mixture of planning and disorientation, a person caught between impulse and intention. The FBI would later analyze these behaviors in detail, finding patterns that hinted at premeditation alongside confusion, revealing the intricate psychological layers behind his actions. It is critical to understand that Nick's trajectory was not created in a vacuum. Family dynamics, public pressure, personality traits, and private conflicts all intersected to shape the person he became. The FBI's findings would later underscore this, revealing notes, behaviors, and evidence that reflected both deliberate intent and deep emotional turmoil. For investigators, psychologists, and the public alike, the question became, how could someone so close, so familiar, and so loved harbor such lethal intent? Even as we examine Nick's upbringing, we confront the uncomfortable reality that familial love does not always prevent tragedy. Privilege, opportunity, and affection can coexist with frustration, obsession, and anger. And in Nick's case, these emotions had been quietly building, intensifying under the surface until they erupted into violence. The Reiner family home, once a symbol of success, comfort, and security, had become the stage for an act that would shock Hollywood, the nation, and the world. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is how little anyone could anticipate what would happen next. Friends, neighbors, and even the family itself had only glimpsed fragments of the emotional storm inside Nick. The signs were subtle, easy to dismiss, and tragically insufficient to prevent the outcome. And while the public saw a family tragedy in headlines, the FBI saw a complex psychological puzzle, a young man whose internal conflicts had escalated into the unthinkable. The story of Nick Reiner is a story of contrasts, charm and volatility, privilege and frustration, closeness and distance. It is the story of a son trapped in the shadows of his parents' legacy, navigating a world of expectation while harboring feelings that no one fully understood. Understanding Nick is essential because without it, the subsequent events, the murders, the investigation, and the shocking FBI discoveries cannot be fully grasped. And yet, even as we try to comprehend his psyche, one fact remains certain. The line between affection and obsession, between frustration and lethal intent, had been crossed. The Reiner family would pay the ultimate price, and the FBI's investigation would reveal layers of evidence and behavior that would stun even seasoned agents. What Nick did in the early hours of that Sunday would mark a point of no return. Every choice, every suppressed emotion, and every unnoticed warning sign converged to create a tragedy that no one could have predicted. But what came next? The evidence the FBI uncovered, the clues that exposed a dark and deliberate pattern, would shock the world and redefine how we view this family forever. Imagine a party filled with Hollywood laughter, glasses clinking, and the kind of casual banter that seems harmless. Now imagine, hidden beneath the surface of that cheerful scene, tension simmering between father and son, tension so palpable that it would later seem like the prelude to a nightmare. This was the night at Conan O'Brien's house, just hours before the Reiners' lives were brutally cut short. Saturday night in Los Angeles is usually alive with energy, especially in the circles that Rob Reiner moved in. Stars mingled with creatives, stories were swapped, and everyone knew that Hollywood events often serve as stages not just for conversation, but for subtle power plays. The Reiners arrived, Rob charismatic as ever, Michelle poised and warm, and Nick. Well, Nick was a mix of charm and intensity, his presence understated yet noticeable. On the surface, they appeared to be just another family enjoying an evening among friends. But beneath the laughter, the undercurrents were unmistakable. Witnesses at the party later recalled that Rob and Nick had a brief but loud argument. The details of the confrontation are sketchy, but the intensity of the exchange was enough to be noticed by those nearby. Words were sharp, voices rose, and for a moment, the air seemed charged. Friends later described the argument as unusual for its heat and brevity, short, explosive, and over almost before anyone could comprehend it. To outsiders, it may have seemed inconsequential, just another fleeting family disagreement. But in retrospect, it was one of the first visible signs that the storm inside the Reiner household was far from ordinary. What made the argument so significant wasn't merely what was said, it was what was unsaid. Observers reported tension in body language, fleeting glares, and subtle gestures that hinted at underlying resentment. Nick's frustration was visible, Rob's authority asserted, and Michelle, ever the mediator, tried to smooth the interaction without drawing attention. In those few minutes, a complex family dynamic was laid bare. Admiration entangled with resentment, respect entangled with defiance, love entangled with anger. For the casual observer, the family appeared normal once the argument ended. Laughter returned, conversations flowed, and the night continued. But in truth, a fracture had been exposed. Experts in family psychology later emphasized that moments like these, when small conflicts escalate and then are suppressed, can leave lingering psychological impacts. The tension doesn't dissipate, it simmers. It grows in the background, sometimes for years, until it finds a breaking point. After the party, Rob and Michelle returned to their Brentwood estate, likely unaware of the storm brewing so close behind them. Nick's movements after leaving the party were critical. He returned to the guest house, isolated, possibly reflecting on the argument, replaying grievances, and allowing emotions to intensify. Surveillance would later reveal that in the early hours of Sunday morning, Nick left the estate briefly, checked into a nearby hotel, and later appeared in public surveillance footage. Each movement painted a picture of a young man caught between impulse and intent, between emotion and premeditation. What makes this night particularly chilling is the duality of appearances versus reality. To the public, the Reiners were a picture-perfect family, elegant, accomplished, and charismatic. To friends at the party, they were just another Hollywood family enjoying a Saturday night. But behind the smiles, the argument exposed something far darker. A clash of emotions that had been quietly building for years. A father's expectations colliding with a son's frustrations. A mother's mediating love insufficient to prevent the catastrophe that would follow. The psychology of such confrontations is complex. Arguments between parent and adult child are common, but the intensity and emotional charge of this one suggests something more significant. There was a spark, a trigger that, for reasons outsiders can barely comprehend, escalated into violence. Experts later analyzed this interaction, suggesting that when underlying resentments, perceived slights, and suppressed emotions converge, even minor conflicts can erupt in extreme ways. The party at Conan O'Brien's was, in retrospect, the flashpoint. An event that would haunt everyone involved, now viewed as the last night the Reiners were alive. And yet, there is a chilling element of foresight that the FBI would uncover. Even after the murders, investigators would find signs that Nick had been obsessively preparing, even subconsciously, for what he was about to do. The argument, while brief, may have catalyzed actions already brewing beneath the surface, plans and emotions that had been quietly festering over time. The evidence suggested that the moment at the party was not just an argument, it was a tipping point. Friends and attendees would later struggle to reconcile the laughter and fun of that night with the horror that followed. How could such a joyful gathering precede such an unimaginable act? The contrast between what people saw and what was about to happen is stark, almost surreal. It is this dissonance, the ordinary mingling with the extraordinary, that makes the Reiners' tragedy so haunting. And then there's the question of motive. While authorities have yet to fully disclose what drove Nick to commit the murders, the events at the party provide critical context. Anger, resentment, feelings of inadequacy, or perceived slights. All these elements may have collided in a way that created a perfect storm. The FBI would later interpret evidence from this night as a crucial piece of the puzzle, demonstrating how even seemingly minor conflicts can escalate when psychological pressures are ignored or misunderstood. After leaving the party, Nick's behavior became increasingly erratic. Early Sunday morning, he checked into a Santa Monica hotel, a mere 4 miles from his parents' home. Surveillance footage later placed him in a convenience store, interacting briefly with strangers, and then, ultimately, being apprehended by law enforcement in South Los Angeles. Each of these movements tells a story. A young man caught between flight and confrontation, between guilt and calculation, between instinct and intent. But what makes the night at Conan O'Brien's truly unsettling is how easily it could have been dismissed. Friends and colleagues described the argument as short, a minor blip in an otherwise normal evening. Yet the FBI would later reveal that this moment contained a crucial emotional intensity that, when combined with other evidence, painted a disturbing picture of Nick's state of mind. Small conflicts, they discovered, can be the sparks that ignite long-suppressed impulses, especially in a young man whose relationships, identity, and emotional regulation were already under strain. As we examine this night, one thing becomes clear: the tragedy was not sudden. It did not appear out of nowhere. It was a culmination of decades of familial dynamics, personality clashes, and unspoken emotional struggles. The party was a lens through which we can glimpse the tension that had been quietly building. And the FBI's later findings would confirm that the behaviors observed that evening were not anomalies. They were part of a broader pattern that led directly to one of the most shocking events in Hollywood history. The night at Conan O'Brien's was, in essence, the calm before the storm. Socially, it was a gathering like countless others. Emotionally, it was the tipping point, a moment when unresolved tensions surged to the surface. The contrast between the outward normalcy and the inner chaos is almost unbearable to reconcile, yet it is critical to understanding what happened next. And then the unimaginable occurred. In the early hours of Sunday, within hours of leaving the party, the Reiner household would be transformed into a crime scene. Lives would end, futures would be shattered, and the FBI would be called to decipher the evidence, uncovering details that would shock even seasoned investigators. The Brentwood estate, nestled in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, was a picture of luxury, elegance, and quiet prestige. Lawns meticulously manicured, walls adorned with art, hallways echoing with decades of family memories. To the untrained eye, it was just another celebrity home. But on that Sunday afternoon, it became a scene that no one could forget, a place where tragedy had carved its permanent mark. The bodies of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were discovered around 3:40 p.m., a discovery that would immediately send shockwaves through the city. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office confirmed that both had died from multiple sharp force injuries. Not one, not two, but a series of deliberate wounds that suggested rage, precision, and terrifying intent. To investigators, this was no random act of violence. This was personal. The scene itself was harrowing. Bloodstains marked the floors, walls, and furniture, patterns revealing the intensity and location of the attacks. Every detail was meticulously documented by law enforcement and later analyzed by the FBI. Sharp force injuries indicate not just an act of aggression, but also a psychological state, an emotional storm expressed through physical action. Each wound told a story: the anger, the deliberation, the closeness of the attacker to the victims. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was sustained and violent. For those who loved Rob and Michelle, the scene was unimaginable. How could a family home, a place of safety, laughter, and love, transform into the site of such horror? Friends described the Reiners as a couple devoted to each other, active in the community, and protective of their family. Yet, the crime scene revealed a grim reality. Even in a home of wealth, influence, and visibility, danger can lurk close to the heart, sometimes originating from within. Nick Reiner, their son, became the immediate focus. Investigators quickly determined that he had been living in the guest house on the property, a mere few steps away from the main home. His proximity raised unsettling questions. How could someone live so close, with such access, and commit acts so lethal without prior detection? What psychological forces drove him to cross a line that most would never imagine? The FBI would later analyze every movement, every decision, and every potential trigger, piecing together a profile of a son whose inner life had become dangerously detached from external reality. The crime scene was also significant for what it revealed about planning. Items were found in positions that suggested premeditation, rather than purely spontaneous violence. Investigators noted patterns in the attack that hinted at a combination of both impulsive rage and calculated intent. This duality, of planning and emotional explosion, is rare, and it immediately elevated the gravity of the case. Forensic experts pointed to details that were both shocking and revealing. Blood spatter analysis showed the angles and intensity of attacks, giving insight into the sequence of events. Objects in the room, displaced furniture, and other disturbances were carefully documented. Investigators observed the spatial relationships between the victims and the assailant, noting distances, proximity, and potential points of struggle. Each piece of evidence became a story, a glimpse into the chaos and the mind of the attacker. One of the most haunting discoveries was the emotional weight embedded in the scene. This was not just about the physical act of violence. It was about the deep psychological state behind it. The FBI and LAPD later described elements of the scene as indicative of a personal vendetta, a term that sends chills when applied to a family setting. The proximity of Nick's living quarters, combined with the nature of the injuries, suggested both access and familiarity, a chilling reminder that the greatest threats can come from the people we trust most. The investigators' approach was methodical. They documented every corner, photographed every detail, and collected evidence with the precision required for both forensic analysis and legal proceedings. Items ranging from potential weapons to personal notes were scrutinized for clues. This meticulous process would later reveal the FBI's most shocking findings, evidence not just of the murders themselves, but of underlying tensions, obsessions, and patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. Neighbors and friends, upon learning the details, were left in disbelief. The Reiners' home had always seemed like a sanctuary, a safe haven in a city known for its unpredictability. The stark contrast between perception and reality forced many to question what signs they may have overlooked. Was there something subtle, a moment of tension, a gesture, a word, that could have foreshadowed this tragedy? For the investigators, every detail mattered, because every overlooked moment could provide insight into motive and intent. Beyond the forensic analysis, the crime scene highlighted the emotional devastation of the event. Bloodstains, broken items, and the arrangement of the room spoke not only to violence, but to personal history, domestic interactions, and psychological states. Investigators later noted that the scene had the hallmarks of an intensely personal attack. A son turning against his parents, wielding not just a knife, but years of suppressed emotion. As law enforcement pieced together the scene, the role of timing became critical. The murders likely occurred in the early hours of Sunday morning, hours before the bodies were discovered. Nick's movements after the crime, hotel check-ins, public appearances on surveillance footage, and eventual arrest provided a timeline that intersected with the physical evidence in haunting ways. The FBI analyzed these patterns meticulously, uncovering behavioral clues that painted a portrait of a young man in turmoil, organized enough to act with intent, yet emotionally frayed enough to be unpredictable. Even for seasoned FBI agents, the crime scene was deeply unsettling. The combination of personal history, physical evidence, and psychological complexity made this case unlike many others. Every object, every mark, every wound became part of a larger narrative. A story of rage, family dynamics, and emotional collapse. The investigators would later reveal that the scene contained not just clues about what had happened, but about why it happened. The intensity, precision, and personal nature of the violence suggested a pre-existing emotional buildup, culminating in an act that was as shocking as it was tragic. The contrast between the Reiners' public image and the private horror uncovered by the FBI was stark. To the world, they were a respected family, icons of Hollywood, and figures of love and philanthropy. In reality, the FBI's findings revealed a pattern of tension, psychological struggle, and personal conflict that no one outside the family fully comprehended. The crime scene, in that sense, was not just a location, it was a revelation. It told a story of suppressed anger, of family pressure, and of a young man whose inner world had been quietly deteriorating until it erupted in violence. And yet, even with all this evidence, the FBI knew there was more to uncover. The scene itself raised as many questions as it answered. What exactly had triggered Nick? What patterns of thought or behavior led him to this act? How much of it was premeditated, and how much was driven by an uncontrollable emotional surge? Every question pointed toward a deeper truth, one that would emerge in the coming days as investigators delved further into the psychological and behavioral evidence left behind. The crime scene was the first tangible glimpse into a tragedy that had been years in the making. It was a place where a family's legacy collided with unspoken resentments, where private struggles met public scrutiny, and where the ordinary setting of a home became the stage for one of the most shocking events in recent Hollywood history. By late Sunday evening, the city of Los Angeles was already reeling from the horrifying discovery at the Reiner estate. The question on everyone's mind was the same. Who could commit such an unthinkable act? The answer, when it came, shocked not just the public, but the law enforcement officials working the case. The suspect was the last person anyone wanted to imagine: Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle. Nick's arrest took place around 9:15 p.m. in the Exposition Park neighborhood of South Los Angeles, several miles from the family's Brentwood home. Surveillance footage had already placed him at key locations throughout the day, most notably a hotel in Santa Monica, where he had checked in early Sunday morning, and a nearby convenience store. Each of these movements would later be analyzed by investigators to construct a detailed timeline of his actions between the murders and his apprehension. The logistics of the arrest were methodical. Law enforcement officers, armed with the weight of evidence from the crime scene and surveillance data, approached Nick carefully. For the police, the challenge was not just apprehending a suspect, but understanding the psychological state of a man who had just allegedly murdered both his parents. High emotions, public interest, and the gravity of the situation added layers of complexity to what would otherwise have been a standard procedure. Witnesses in the area described a calm but tense scene as police took Nick into custody. There were no immediate signs of resistance, which in itself is a fascinating detail. For someone allegedly capable of such extreme violence, the subdued demeanor suggested a man either resigned to capture or emotionally detached from the consequences of his actions. Later, the FBI would note that this behavior aligned with evidence of premeditation combined with a psychological state of detachment, a duality that made the case particularly complex. Nick's arrest also immediately raised questions about motive and mental state. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues struggled to reconcile the image of the man they knew with the act he was accused of committing. How could someone so close, someone raised with love, privilege, and opportunity, commit such a violent and irreversible act against the very people who had shaped his life? Law enforcement would later reveal that while the physical evidence was compelling, the psychological evidence was equally critical in understanding both the arrest and the events leading up to it. Once in custody, Nick was questioned about his movements and the murders. His responses, body language, and interactions with investigators became part of the investigation. Every pause, every word, every reaction was analyzed for insight into his mindset. Law enforcement officers noted a mixture of evasiveness and detachment, elements that, combined with the crime scene evidence, painted a troubling picture of a young man whose inner life had become dangerously unstable. The arrest also marked the first time authorities had to confront the public reality of the case. Headlines were filled with shock, grief, and speculation. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from disbelief to horror, as people struggled to reconcile the son's image with the crimes attributed to him. The FBI, aware of the intense public scrutiny, approached the case with extreme care, ensuring that both the investigation and the arrest process were conducted with professionalism and attention to detail. One of the most unsettling aspects of the arrest was the calmness with which Nick appeared to move between locations after the murders. From the Santa Monica hotel check-in to the convenience store surveillance footage, each action suggested a blend of calculated decision-making and emotional detachment. Experts later noted that this pattern could indicate a level of planning or psychological compartmentalization, a dangerous combination that made the case both baffling and chilling. Another point of analysis for law enforcement was Nick's access to the family estate. Living in the guest house provided proximity, familiarity, and opportunity. Investigators quickly recognized that the relationship between perpetrator and victims, combined with intimate knowledge of the property, was a critical factor in understanding how the crime was executed. It was a stark reminder that the greatest threats often come not from strangers, but from those closest to us. The arrest also prompted a deeper examination of Nick's history, relationships, and behavior. Investigators began piecing together reports of prior incidents, behavioral patterns, and interactions with family and friends. Even seemingly minor details, a sharp remark, a withdrawn behavior, a fleeting disagreement, were now analyzed for their potential connection to the crime. The FBI treated every piece of information as a puzzle piece, understanding that the arrest was only the beginning of uncovering the deeper narrative of tension, resentment, and emotional buildup. Once taken into custody, Nick faced immediate legal proceedings. Charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including the use of a deadly weapon, a knife. These charges underscored the severity of the crimes and set the stage for a complex legal battle that would involve both physical and psychological evidence. The legal framing of the arrest and charges reflected not just the act itself, but the broader implications of premeditation and emotional intent. While law enforcement and legal authorities focused on the procedural aspects of the arrest, the public grappled with emotional reactions. Friends and acquaintances of the Reiners expressed shock, grief, and disbelief. How could a son, raised with care and privilege, commit an act that seemed unimaginable? The arrest was more than a law enforcement milestone. It was a cultural shockwave, a story that challenged assumptions about family, trust, and the potential for hidden darkness in even the most seemingly perfect households. The FBI's investigation didn't stop at the arrest. Agents continued to analyze the crime scene, Nick's movements, and the psychological profile emerging from his behavior. Every detail became part of a larger narrative. A story not only of crime, but of emotional tension, suppressed conflict, and the dangerous potential of unaddressed familial and psychological pressures. Nick's arrest was both a culmination and a beginning. It was the moment when theory became fact, when suspicion became official, and when the world began to understand the scale of the tragedy. Yet, even in the hours following his apprehension, questions remained. What had driven him to this act? What warning signs had been missed? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what evidence would the FBI uncover that would shock the world even further? Because the arrest, while significant, was only the first step in a series of revelations that would redefine what people thought they knew about the Reiner family. The truth, as investigators would soon discover, was far more complex, far more disturbing, and far more shocking than anyone could have anticipated. As soon as Nick Reiner was in custody, the FBI and Los Angeles law enforcement launched one of the most meticulous investigations the city had seen in years. This was not just a case of a crime. It was a puzzle that combined Hollywood fame, family dynamics, and psychological complexity. Agents knew they were dealing with more than just a violent act. They were confronting a web of personal history, emotional tension, and deliberate actions that required deep analysis. The first step was to secure and examine the Brentwood estate. For the FBI, the scene was a trove of evidence, but it was also deeply unsettling. Every corner, every object, every trace of blood told a story. Agents meticulously photographed and cataloged the estate, reconstructing the sequence of events from the minute the first attack occurred to the moment law enforcement arrived. The goal was clear: uncover the truth in as much detail as possible. What the FBI discovered was chilling. The crime scene revealed evidence of premeditation, including items displaced in ways that suggested deliberate preparation. Blood spatter patterns indicated both rage and precision, providing insight into the emotional state of the perpetrator during the attacks. Forensic experts noted that the violence was intensely personal. The wounds were close, targeted, and deliberate. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. It was sustained aggression, a manifestation of years of suppressed emotion. The investigation also focused heavily on Nick's movements before and after the murders. Security footage showed him leaving the Reiner estate, checking into a hotel in Santa Monica, and appearing at a convenience store, all within hours of the killings. Each location was analyzed to understand his mindset, timing, and possible planning. The FBI treated these movements as critical clues, offering insight into both the execution of the crime and the psychological state behind it. Agents also examined communications, personal notes, and electronic devices. Every text message, email, and digital footprint became a piece of the puzzle. Investigators sought to determine whether there had been long-standing resentment, premeditation, or other indicators of motive. While the public had speculated about possible reasons for the tragedy, the FBI worked quietly and meticulously to build a factual, evidence-based understanding. One of the most shocking discoveries came from personal documents found in Nick's possession. These items suggested that the son had harbored grievances and fixations for years, details that, when combined with the crime scene analysis, painted a portrait of a deeply troubled individual. The FBI noted the intensity of these obsessions, linking them to the violence he committed. To the agents, it was a stark reminder that violent acts often have roots in long simmering emotions, even when they appear sudden to the outside world. Interviews with neighbors, friends, and acquaintances were another critical part of the investigation. The FBI sought to understand not just the physical evidence, but also the behavioral patterns of Nick leading up to the murders. People described him as both charming and volatile, polite and irritable, socially engaged yet often isolated. These contradictions provided key insights into his personality and potential triggers for the attacks. The investigation also explored the dynamics between Nick and his parents. Rob Reiner's reputation as a disciplined, assertive, and charismatic figure contrasted sharply with Nick's reported frustrations and mood swings. Michelle, described as nurturing and patient, had often mediated conflicts, but the FBI found evidence that suggests her efforts could not fully mitigate the tension. Understanding these family dynamics became essential to building a psychological profile and anticipating potential motives. Forensic analysis extended to the weapon used in the killings. The knife, classified as a deadly and dangerous weapon, was examined for fingerprints, DNA traces, and other forensic markers. Blood spatter and wound patterns were meticulously studied to reconstruct the sequence of attacks. The combination of these details allowed investigators to understand not only how the crime was committed, but also the intent and emotional intensity behind it. The FBI's approach was deliberate and methodical. They knew that every piece of evidence, no matter how small, could provide critical insights. From the layout of the estate to Nick's movements after the murders, each detail was documented and analyzed. Even the brief argument at Conan O'Brien's party was revisited as investigators sought to understand triggers, behavioral patterns, and emotional escalation. By the end of the initial investigation phase, the FBI had a picture of a young man caught in a complex web of emotions and intentions. Nick Reiner was not just a suspect. He was a study in how suppressed frustration, familial tension, and personal struggles can culminate in violent outcomes. Every detail reinforced the notion that the tragedy was the result of both personal choice and long-simmering psychological dynamics. As the investigation unfolded, authorities also discovered elements that shocked even seasoned agents. Personal writings, patterns of behavior, and small but significant actions suggested that Nick had been thinking about the violence in advance. While the killings may have been triggered by immediate conflict, the FBI found evidence that emotional buildup, obsession, and fixation had played a role in setting the stage for tragedy. This meticulous process was critical not only for understanding the crime, but also for the forthcoming legal proceedings. Every discovery, every piece of evidence, every observation would contribute to the charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances. The FBI's findings would ultimately reveal a layered narrative, one of personal conflict, psychological turmoil, and premeditated violence that unfolded with shocking precision. The investigation also highlighted the emotional and psychological complexity of the Reiner family tragedy. Agents noted the intense personal nature of the crime, the proximity of the perpetrator to the victims, and the stark contrast between public perception and private reality. The case was not simply a violent act. It was a study in human behavior, family dynamics, and the consequences of unaddressed emotional conflict. And yet, even with all the evidence gathered, the FBI understood that this was only the beginning. Every answer raised new questions. How deep did Nick's grievances run? What had gone unnoticed by family and friends? And perhaps most unsettling, what clues, hidden in plain sight, would explain the full scope of this tragedy? Because the FBI's discoveries, while already shocking, were only the first layer. The deeper revelations, the ones that would truly stun the public and redefine the story of the Reiners, were still to come. As the FBI delved deeper into the Reiner case, investigators discovered evidence that went far beyond the crime scene and surveillance footage. What they uncovered would shock even seasoned agents. Details that revealed not only the method of the crime, but the psychological state of the perpetrator, his obsessions, and the premeditated elements that had remained hidden from everyone else. The first piece of hidden evidence was a notebook discovered in Nick Reiner's guest house. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary personal journal, but as agents examined its contents, it became clear that it contained far more than casual notes or reflections. Pages were filled with intense grievances, perceived slights, and troubling fixations on his parents. Lines that may have seemed harmless on the surface revealed a deeper pattern of resentment, anger, and emotional instability. Some entries referenced specific arguments, while others alluded to long-standing feelings of inadequacy and alienation. For the FBI, the notebook was a psychological goldmine, offering insight into the motivations that had driven him to commit such a violent act. The language in the notebook was startling. It alternated between analytical observations and emotional outbursts, reflecting a mind grappling with intense internal conflict. Investigators noted recurring themes: a sense of injustice, feelings of being misunderstood, and an obsession with control. Each page seemed to build upon the last, creating a narrative that suggested both planning and emotional fixation. It was clear to the agents that Nick had been wrestling with these feelings for an extended period, long before the tragic events unfolded. Alongside the notebook, investigators discovered digital evidence that painted an equally disturbing picture. Searches on computers and mobile devices revealed research into weapons, security patterns, and scenarios that could be interpreted as premeditation.